So again, we've got 4 breakout groups that are going to report back. We will aim for each group to have a total of about 15 minutes, including the discussion. And if there's a discussion that's especially useful and interesting, we will have a little bit of a hedge there.
Anyway.
So with that, why don't we start with the Clinical Trial and Research Data Group. David Alonso will be reporting out. No? Oh, Lee. Okay. Lee Lancashire.
All right. So I think we had a pretty good discussion around clinical data and research data. We had Laura and Rebecca give the overviews, thinking about some of the challenges they see with data sharing. I think a lot of the conversation was really around data sharing. We saw many overlapping issues that have already been discussed today, data curation and harmonization, etc. But I'll walk you through kind of the take-home messages. So we thought, thinking about kind of researcher incentives around data sharing, we should really kind of think about resourcing data and how we make it available and kind of make that very specific to the goals. So think about what the researcher has in mind, whether that's a publication. So what are the journal requirements around the data sharing? We should be specific around that. Is it a funder requirement? So is that another incentive to share data? If the funder restricts funding availability based on you having data available, is there some ethical commitment to the participants, or do we just want to make data available to drive new science, new discoveries? So we kind of spoke a few minutes about those different ways of incentivizing researchers. We spoke a little bit about the platforms themselves that host data and how utilization of the platforms has often lagged behind the contribution of data. So that was an interesting topic we touched on. Perhaps that's got something to do with, again, the harmonization of the data. So can we create and harmonize data in such a way that it's aligned so that we can combine our cohorts? And also kind of general awareness is perhaps something we can improve upon. So kind of how we make the researcher aware that there's data available. Next slide, please. So we spoke about kind of clinical trials. So this was clinical trial and research data. So on the clinical trials, from the clinical trials perspective, we thought about how we can do better to plan those upfront, to promote the reuse of data first. So really kind of thinking about what data is already available. Can we understand better what similar trials have been conducted? Can we leverage the data that has been collected and use that in some pre-analysis, perhaps, something we do before a clinical trial? We spoke about how aggregated data is currently available on clinicaltrials.gov, but this is really summary. It doesn't contain the raw data, the individual participant level data. So Rebecca spoke about how some of that is accessible on Vivly. We thought something which would be really helpful to the community would be an inventory of data and also an inventory of platforms. So there were questions around kind of what platforms are out there that host data, how many are there? So we talked about that, and we spoke about the Google Sheets for this session would be kind of a catalog of platforms and a catalog of data that is available in those platforms. We thought that might be something which we could work together on and make that available to the community. And I think that really goes together with the next point about kind of making data sets more findable. So we also had an interesting discussion about the technology and the platforms themselves that host the data. There was an interesting concept about first mover disadvantage in this area. So there's been a platform developed which has a specific use case in mind, but because technologies are improving so quickly, then the technology itself becomes replaced. and there's a new technology which then replaces it. So the data was thought to be the most important thing. So we should think about how we can better share the data, potentially across the platforms. So it's important to come up with maybe some core set of metadata, which allows us to essentially integrate cohort data across platforms, interoperate across those platforms, so that we can then enable the researcher to access those data and perform those analyses. Is there another slide? Okay, yeah. So we had another interesting point around kind of, again, thinking about how we plan studies and how we balance the value of collecting as much data as possible right now for our current study versus planning for future collection. So, for example, how do we think about perhaps technologies that are not in existence yet? So in the future, we might want to profile samples a different way than we do now. So how do we balance kind of collecting the data or digitizing the data today versus maybe holding back some biosamples for future data collection as those new ways of profiling patients come to fruition? And I think I covered the rest of the points. Yeah, we're just emphasizing this point about kind of the platforms versus the data, and how we can really identify which platforms exist, what types of data do they host, and how we might combine those and integrate those data sets to perform our large cohort studies. So I think that captures our discussion.
All right. Questions or comments?
So I think, one of the things that I haven't heard addressed, which I'm just realizing is a gap in what we've been talking about, is thinking about not only sustainability of data platforms and long-term thinking about data, but how will we integrate data gathered today with data gathered tomorrow, right? And I think that is kind of our only hope of actually building up large data sets. The funding is only per project. And I just wanted to bring that out. I think that serious attention to thinking about, first of all, a common way of describing data models. And then how do you actually maintain and migrate data across versions of data models? They won't be constant today, from now, but we've got to think about that. And if the investment is, that there will be, millions today and millions tomorrow, well, that accumulates, and we've got to, it's a huge gap.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing we've been doing with the Brain Commons is developing a graph-based data model which allows you to capture multimodal data at the case level. So as new data is generated on an individual, that can be brought into that data model. But absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think thinking about provenance of the data model, provenance of the data, the analysis, all of those things should be captured within that as well.
Right. Other questions or comments? I will note that clinicaltrials.gov does have some of the data are available at the individual patient level, and they're pointed to depending on the trial.
Okay.
So, yes.
Yeah, and I can be really loud. I don't have a microphone, but I mean, one other type of get a microphone. Oh, darn! I thought it was a challenge. One other type of maybe not data that we also should think about capturing are results that are reusable. So, for example, machine learning signatures that other people could then try out in their data and so on. And
yeah, absolutely. That's great point. Yep.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. If not, thanks a lot, Lee. Appreciate that. Next, we have the genetic data group. And I think, will that be Arpana who will be presenting? Yes, okay.
So we obviously and not surprisingly had a lot of discussion surrounding GDPR and HIPAA and the common rule. And as you'll see, this will be a recurring theme, and it bothered us 3 slides worth. Forgive me if I keep repeating myself. One of the challenges that we were trying to grapple with is whether genomic data are effectively anonymized at any point. HIPAA makes certain allowances for having safe harbors and for de-identifying data. I added there that there is a lot of variability at the institutional level. I come from WashU, where genomic data are considered non-de-identified. So for some of us who actually have access to identifiers, but otherwise they tend to take a fairly conservative position. But this is going to change with common rule that allows for technologies which could include the analysis of whole genome sequencing data. So how do we stay in compliance with these rules? And you'll see that this trickles through, but let me go through some of the other challenges that we talked about and ways forward. The size of genomic data really necessitate using the cloud for computing, so this is necessary for us. But how we anonymize data and what it really means to anonymize genomic data came up. Most often we're using genome-wide common variation data, so the idea of identifiability in terms of a single variant or a rare polymorphism or a private mutation is perhaps less of a concern. But what we thought might be more of a challenge is, given the data that you have, are you able to then work backwards and recontact someone to participate in a study or merge with other sources of data, where that could then lead to identifiability. There was discussion about the session in the morning talking about protection of privacy, and the paper that was showcased suggesting that given a set of demographic identifiers or variables and genomic data, you could potentially identify a majority of individuals or participants in the study. And whether that means that data are structured so that outliers are removed, so that data are presented in a certain way, it's just something that we need to grapple with, especially with genomic data. And what that led us to then is why genomic data are considered so special and so unique. And this idea that your DNA provides some kind of footprint or label, if you will, and correlating that in particular with neuroscience data related to mental health or cognition may then produce certain challenges. So the things we talked about were the social stigma that's associated with one's individual susceptibility to mental health conditions that are being studied, and then a discussion of the interpretation of harm and what harm might mean. What would be the challenge associated with a breach? Whether this ranges, again, based on the discussion this morning, from insurance challenges or disability or employer-related issues. Somebody mentioned the ApoE4 polymorphism, which increases your likelihood of a variety of cognition-related outcomes, including Alzheimer's disease, late onset. And the idea that that kind of information, if there were to be a breach, might actually have real-life implications, but legally the context of harm might be quite variable. So that brought us to discussion of what the landscape of re-identifiability might be. How re-identifiable are data that are currently available, and how might that change? So with the current data, it's plausible that one could use them to re-identify somebody by merging with other data sets. We've been doing genome-wide analyses for an extended period of time. Thankfully, this has not come up. There are data use agreements in place that ask you to swear up and down that you will not try to do this. And in some ways, there's a requirement with genomic data to make sure that they're secure and that the individuals using those data are not trying to actively re-identify anybody. This also leads to how this information is presented in a consent. How do you let individuals, participants, know what the risks to their privacy might be? What happens if there is a breach, and what that re-identification may mean for them. And there was, again, this revisiting from the morning session of how consent language could be rephrased or put together so that there's information that's put forth to the participant in terms of what happens if there's re-identifiability. There was also a lot of discussion, this will come up a couple of times, about this balance between scientific discovery and protection of privacy. The need for us to be able to do research with all the data that are available while simultaneously ensuring that the data are protected. And this is going to come up one more time when it comes to infrastructure, so I'll talk a little bit about it then. We talked a little bit also about vulnerable populations. And the risk-benefit analysis here, the analogy that came up was Arizona State University's legal proceedings related to the use of genetic data from certain tribal populations. We need to do research on vulnerable populations or special populations. Otherwise, our research becomes predominantly Eurocentric. So there is a dire need, if I may say so, to be able to access all populations and make our research more generalizable. There's going to be growth in terms of not just what we find, but also in terms of tool development if we do this, especially in genomics. The risk is obvious, right? So I think partnerships with the representative groups that are involved and having institutional agreements in place to ensure privacy and protection, and I think basically following good practices when it comes to doing what you said you would do and not going any further than that. The last topic that we took on a little bit in this domain was the use of incidental findings and return of results. I think there was general consensus that much like the neuroimaging field for genetics, this is a challenge. It's noteworthy that one cannot actually disclose incidental findings unless the genotyping is verified by a CLIA-certified lab. So in that ways, there are some barriers to what you can report back to a participant. But there are other aspects to this, right? Should a genetic counselor be present? How do you convey the magnitude of the risk? What is considered to be a finding worthy of reporting back to an individual rather than just disturbing them or, creating false alarm? And the idea here was really to think about best practices. To which several of our speakers mentioned that we didn't need to have one way to do this, but we needed to have a set of standards where one could go down different pathways, but come up with an approach that kind of satisfied the interests of the participant and the responsibilities of the researcher. We also talked a little bit about existing resources and maximizing them. Mike talked about a variety of existing cloud-based resources, and there was a lot of discussion about cost and maybe leveraging a sandbox-type platform where you could develop or test prototypes in small data sets, ensure scalability, and then also ensure that all the vulnerabilities associated with the code, with the software, with the idea and the pipeline were identified before it was uploaded into the cloud. This also led us to discuss, again, the GDPR and how we might be able to utilize data that are stored within the EU, using a cloud environment to perhaps push through summary statistics or weights without actually breaching GDPR requirements. Let's see. Lastly, we talked about reproducibility and standards. There seems to be a need for the harmonization of approaches to harmonize data. Notebooks, GitHub, ways in which we can ensure that the code we're putting out there has been checked and verified. There was a strong recommendation for using external audits, not just ensuring readability of your code, making sure that it's marked up, but also ensuring safety. There was a lot of discussion about how much code should be released with the concerns related to inadvertent disclosure of file names or pathways, so ensuring that there are a number of individuals looking at this code before it actually goes up into a cloud environment and is used by everyone. We talked a lot about infrastructure, whether this involves, well, at several levels, whether we're talking about during peer and proposal review of grants. Do we have the statistical expertise on these committees to know that the code that's being used has been vetted and is the best resource that's out there, as well as something that's come up again in the last session and in the morning, the infrastructure and resources to maintain these data for their lifespan, not the lifespan of an R01 or not the lifespan of a project. And the idea here is also an investment in resources that are available to these cloud-based services or local university-based services. There's a trade-off between innovative research in some ways and research that's easy to do on a cloud, if you're constantly asking someone to upload a new software package for you on the cloud because you have to stay within a safe environment, you need there to be an individual who's paid to do that. And there needs to be infrastructure and support to be able to do that on a continuous basis. And we run into this with genomics all the time, where we have to work in a cloud environment or we have to work within a restrained environment, but that means you're always up against somebody having to install something for you in order for you to do something unique. We also talked a little bit about what the responsibilities are of data owners, researchers, and the data holders. If there is a breach, whose responsibility is it? And also looking forward, some crystal gazing in terms of how we frame our consents. Where we stand with genomic data right now, broadly, at least for mental health outcomes, is we're still dealing with small proportions of variance, right? So we're not at a point across most of our traits. I study addictions, and we're not there yet, unless you think, knowing how much alcohol you metabolize is going to be helpful. We're not quite there in terms of knowing whether one's genotype is going to fully predict their phenotype. But the expectation is, and that's why we do this work, the expectation is we will get there someday. And so if we're moving in that direction, the consents we write now need to be forward-thinking. We need to be able to think through what happens when we do have a set of markers that can explain a significant amount of the variance in whether an individual is susceptible to schizophrenia or to opioid dependence. So how do we craft our consents to be forward-thinking enough that we don't have to go back and change those consents, and we can continue to share and continue to consider things like return of results in the future? So the last thing I'll leave you with are, of the many things that we discussed, these seem to be the two key categories in which we need to do more work. I think figuring out compliance around GDPR and regulatory standards is going to be essential for genomic research as we move forward. In terms of best practices, two areas came up as needing a lot of attention. The first is code sharing, sharing your code, sharing your software, but doing that after vetting. What are the best practices for that? And then some discussion about looking to the work that's been done in neuroimaging to come up with pathways to potential reporting of incidental findings when that's warranted and when it isn't. So that was our discussion. We'll take some questions. Ben and Mike are both here.
Questions or comments?
Just wondering, it could be beyond the scope of here, but this whole idea of crafting a future-proof consent for when we have definitive patterns or suggestive patterns, perhaps that should be extended into crafting a future-proof plan of attack of when we reach this point, how does that information get fed forward to, whether it's NIDA, whether it's, which to then change policy, enforce a change in policy based on hardcore data. I mean, the idea of crafting the consent around the fact that this hopefully will contribute to our understanding that this will, and when it does, here is what we will do in order to assist you, your family, whatever in the future is likely to also influence the likelihood of people to want to participate. The fact that they may end up in a published paper is one thing. The fact that there's already a path that's been designed based on the way they're giving consent that will then fast forward action into their own family's, community's health arena could be a huge incentive for more participation. I don't know if that's beyond the recommendations we can make, but I think it fits with the whole idea of looking ahead.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Other comments or questions?
Genetic data are not that scary. They're just like any other data.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. And next we have Deanna Barch. And she'll present the output of the neuroimaging data breakout session.
Okay, I just want to thank the rest of our group members. It's always interesting how these groups kind of organically have a life of their own, and we spent a lot of our time talking about economics and sustainability. I think this has been a hot topic among neuroimagers for a long time. And not surprisingly, the issue of what are the economics and how do you plan for sustainability are complex and not always clear. They're very dependent on a lot of factors, from time of day to the type of data, the scope of data. And so part of what we discussed is that some culture change is needed among both funding agencies and investigators and institutions in thinking about what grants look like, what kinds of costs are expected, how do you compute those things. Going forward, it's highly likely that all grants will need to pay for compute resources in some way, shape, or form in a way that wasn't always true. It used to be that many labs had compute resources that you could sort of reuse for different grants, and maybe you ask for some storage costs, but not compute costs. But that is going to be, if we move into more cloud-based resources or shared resources, that's going to need to be a larger piece. And so that reiterates themes from this morning, too, about the importance of funding officers being aware of the needs and educated, and also grant reviewers being aware and being educated about those needs. And so there'll need to be, some best practices with that put forward. We also spent quite some time talking about sort of life cycles of grants versus life cycles of data, because they're not always on the same cycle, and thinking about the fact that the life cycle of data is often longer than the life cycle of a grant. So we had a discussion about kind of developing frameworks for levels of storage and thinking about who's responsible for stewardship of data at different levels of storage. So, when it's no longer in active use, putting it into cold storage, but who's responsible for kind of the stewardship of that data? Is it the investigator? Is it the institution? Is it the owners of the platform, and needing to come up with some frameworks with that? We also talked about the fact that there's a bit of a disconnect in that some of the places for storage, especially mandated storage, don't currently have the ability to do compute as well. And that we need to think about either how to expand those sites. So ENDA would be one example, expand those sites to allow them to be, say, visible to cloud compute resources, or to have options for cloud compute resources, or to have some other venue so that you're not having to sort of do double duty. You've got to store your data here for one purpose, but now you also want to do compute, and so you need to have a second copy. And that seems like a very hopefully solvable problem to help reduce some of that demand. We also discussed the need to develop frameworks, and I'm deliberately using the word framework because we also had a discussion about not wanting to be too draconian and be like, everybody must do it this way, but that there must be frameworks and flexibility for the length of time that data of different types need to be maintained so that people can plan for the future. There are some guidelines in place for like human subject data. Certain IRBs and maybe the NIH has some guidelines for minimum amount of time, but that may not be true for all types of data, and thinking about how to plan for the future there for that. And also, interestingly, developing a framework for thinking about what type of data should be preserved and what data can be released. And we had some interesting discussions about, is it the type of data, so do you keep, I'll just make an example, the NIFTY data versus the DICOM data, or vice versa? Does it also depend on how useful the data is and how robust and reliable it was, or how reproducible it was? So some frameworks, as opposed to necessarily thinking we have to keep absolutely everything, how do we decide what needs to be kept, for how long, in what format, and who's in charge of taking care of that data? We also talked again about the fact that it's really clear that there are multiple countries, institutions, organizations thinking about these same issues, and that we have a real danger of reinventing the wheel over and over and over again, and that we may need some sort of coordinating body to help sort of bring us together. INCF was raised as a possibility to help with some of the coordination so that we aren't reduplicating thinking about developing these frameworks or platforms and rather learning from each other's efforts in these different domains. Okay, next slide. We didn't have as much time to talk about some of these, but we did discuss the issue of thinking about centralized versus decentralized, both in terms of storage and analysis, right? So you can have a framework where there's centralized storage of data versus decentralized storage of data, and you can have frameworks where there's central analysis versus decentralized analysis, and that those may have pros and cons for different people for different purposes and with different constraints. We had a discussion about when you want to use the cloud and sort of what are some of the advantages and what keep people from being willing to take the leap. Jessica has brought up in a couple of venues the important point that if you're getting into like very broad international data sharing efforts or data aggregation efforts that people may trust Amazon more than they might trust your own. They don't know your institution from Adam. They don't know you from Adam, but they might trust Amazon to keep their data safe, so there may be some benefits to cloud-based resources that are more familiar and trustworthy to other people. But there's also sort of a real hump for some people in moving from their more traditional approaches to the cloud-based approach, and it's not, whilst for some it may seem very obvious what the benefits are, those benefits may not always outweigh what are thought to be costs by individual groups or investigators. So kind of helping to think through those cost-benefit analyses and what sorts of infrastructure we can put in place to help people in that regard. So one of the discussions that we had was infrastructure change in the sense that, say you had a big lab, 30 people in your lab that was used to using local compute resources, and everybody was really well trained on how to do that, and now you wanted to move your entire infrastructure to another platform, another lab. How do you get the resources to support that? And might there be some other mechanisms or venues that need to be put into play to help support that transition? And then lastly, I think there was a general belief that when possible, containerization would be a best practice that we would want to recommend, allows for robust and reliable resources and sharing, and making it more available to a number of different people. So I will stop there and open it up for discussion. Everybody's got the end of the day tiredness. Their brains are asleep.
I had just
Sure.
a question. So this sort of dovetails with the last point, the last group, when we're talking about future-proofing data, and how you merge very old data with new data. I was just thinking about a story from the spinal cord injury community where people have recovered paper records from studies that were done in the 90s and digitized them. So I guess that's a future-proof that's like the Dead Sea Scrolls style future-proofing. Yeah, so what's sort of the digital version of that around imaging, for example?
It's an interesting question. The digital version of paper copies of data. Yeah. I open it up to the audience to say is it preserving, the raw DICOM data? Is it, what would you all consider to be sort of the equivalent of that? I'm looking at Dan. I don't know why I'm looking at Dan. Yes.
Peter Wall with Optima Analytics. So is the modern equivalent taking PDFs, that are electronic in nature of the images, and extracting structured data, from those sources, and then making them utilizable for research purposes? So it's stored, in sort of this theoretically unusable format, but if you can develop the technology, which is currently being done, to extract, those measures that are of interest, that maybe that's the modern equivalent?
We have actually done that, taken all of our old paper data in our lab and are systematically hired a work study who is scanning everything into PDF format on the assumption that, you could either have a human go through and code things, or there'll be machine learning approaches that could go through and code that data. And it's saves us a lot of space in the lab for sure.
But when he said paper data, not just published paper data.
No, I
it's
meant
paper from notebooks.
Yeah, no, that's
of
what
people. Okay, got it.
like
It's
the scoring, like the
Yeah.
handwritten notes from the skid.
Yeah,
That the
okay.
person and rather than keeping file cabinets after file cabinets of paper, we've been systematically scanning it all in and saving PDF copies in a HIPAA compliant repository. So.
But having said that, there are now search functions like Meta at Chan Zuckerberg that could then dive into that and start looking for things that the people who analyzed the data in the first place and made pretty figures for published papers might not have found if they're in big enough numbers, right?
Yep. Did you mean it at another level too, though? Like because that's not imaging data per se, right? It's still more of the real world and clinical data.
It sounded like we were talking about PDFs of images. Is that what we're talking about for?
That's what I was suggesting is, potentially the modern equivalent of what your question was about.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Deanna. And last but not least is the Real World Data Breakout Group. Margaret Sutherland.
Okay, guys, I'll be brief, and Stuart, Peter, and Adriana will fill in anything I might have missed. So we started this group just defining what real-world data is, and our definition comes from a publication from the FDA. So it's that data relating to health patient status and or delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And I think that's what really was central to our discussion, because we touched on electronic health records, claims and billing activities, product and disease registries, and also data that's coming from new devices as they come on the market. So what we started with, and Laura, this was for you, I used the at-home PD study as an example, a small example of how NINDS had started to think about bringing real-world data into a cohort study. So basically, at-home PD took participants who had been in 2 phase 3 clinical trials, but had been consented so that they could be recontacted. And basically, when they were recontacted, they were asked, do you want to be part of this ancillary study, which is the at-home PD study. And the at-home PD study basically then allowed the group to move into telemedicine, use of Empower, which is the Sage Biotech platform, and Fox Insight, which is a patient-entered data platform. And so it was an example of where we're looking at taking individual level data from these different data streams and dividing or engineering a solution where we could eventually link these individual data modalities to hopefully come up with a better picture of what Parkinson's is to a patient. So that was how we started the Real World Data session. Adriana then came in and basically gave us her perspective as a researcher, and having worked in with a database where the data is structured, and she can participate in a cohort study, and she understands how she can do hypothesis testing and build out the questions she wants to ask in that type of environment. And then the question she had was, well, what if you wanted to look at other data? So how do you know, for instance, that the data you collect from devices or the data that you might get from other sources are useful, reproducible, and robust? And the question there is, what do we need to do to really validate these other data sources to know how it contributes to the overall picture of a patient going forward? So I think that kind of captures some of the questions we had. Sean gave a really good example of how his group's thinking about how do you help build quality into the medical health record. And so one example was to actually provide tools for the clinicians so that there's value added in terms of what they're doing in collecting that data. So for instance, his example was to have a visualization chart where the clinician can look at the measurements as the collection goes along, so you get feedback in terms of what you're contributing to the data set. So I think, so those were examples in terms of it's kind of, it's not a totally new area. Devices and that have been around for a while, but how do you really work it into what we already know about patient-collected data in a clinical setting? So I can go to the next slide. Maybe I can do that. Oh, thank you. So we discussed how to work in real-world data environment and how to incentivize buy-in and participation. And so Peter was helpful in that. He's the one who has a lot of practical experience in terms of working with electronic health records and also the billing data. And so understanding what brings clinicians value is the important thing. So emphasize the new opportunities in data sharing, the concept of the carrot flavor stick. That was pretty cool. I hadn't heard that one before, but it works well with the research institutions. So how can you give something back to the clinicians if they also are helping bring in better quality data? And then how do you move to a community provider setting? And that's something we didn't necessarily have solutions for, but it's something you want to think about, because a lot of the data that's initially collected is on potentially participants who haven't been diagnosed yet. So how do you handle that? Regular sessions, this was coming from Sean again, where when you start to work with these data types, you really need to think about privacy and ethics and work regularly with those offices to make sure that your data management plan is still current, and it'll change as the data changes. So it's important to evolve with that. And then just in terms of concepts, and this goes back to understanding what's robust, what's accurate, and what's specific data. Basically, it should be the holy grail in electronic healthcare data, but I hope I'm not misquoting you, Peter, but I think you said EHR is messy. So how to build better quality into those records. And one example he gave was that in the EHR right now, you don't necessarily code for seizure frequency and epilepsy, so how can you start capturing that type of data? And one example was to provide a scribe to work with the clinician when you're collecting the data. And I think there were a couple another example where, this is more futuristic, but where you could actually have voice recognition, where the voice recognition then puts that data into a structured form so you get better quality data out of clinician's examination. Just was looking at you, Jane. I remembered when I was talking about that at-home PD, you had a really good idea in that we can go back and contact those participants. So we're looking to the future in terms of bringing in new types of data, but why don't we look back to the past and see if we can get the AHR records so you could see what was happening beforehand, because in Parkinson's, it's very hard to understand what that prodromal state is, so that might be a way to do it. Okay, and I don't know if I have one more slide or not. Sorry, oops, maybe I can do the green button. Oh no, that's great. That's the best result when you're looking for another slide. So I guess overall is just, there are new data types. Oh, darn, guys. All right, critical points for data capture. Capturing of, this is what Sean mentioned. So when we're thinking about the data that comes in, for instance, through a phone platform, you collect location, you collect time, so you have to understand if you're going to strip that and just keep an identifier, how do you also maintain how and when that data was collected? So you have to keep that information intact to make the data useful. Let's see. And how do you incentivize physicians? Some solution is, as I mentioned, that scribe program. The last thing we talked about was cloud, because it was what we were supposed to be talking about. So cloud structure. So basically it's important, why would you use it? Definitely important as new modes of data are being collected. It's quite possible from devices in that the data is going to be very large and you're going to need a cloud environment to actually handle that data size. The key thing, another key thing was data policy, privacy, security, and breach management. When you're in that cloud environment, you have to think about how you're going to monitor how that data is being used. The best solution is not to download, because you have a better way of monitoring data when it's in the cloud environment. Once it's on somebody's laptop, local server, less likely to be able to track what's happened to it. So how do you incentivize use of data in the cloud? And then also data storage, what we were talking about in terms of cloud is not just about data storage, data access, and sharing, but it's also about having analytical tools in place so that that actually incentivizes people to go to use those tools to start looking at their data. So Jupyter Notebooks, workflows should all be in that environment with the data. And then encourage use in the cloud, like I said, rather than download. So that's the last slide, and I think we're ready for questions. And Stuart, Peter, and Adriana, if I forgot something, now's the time.
Great, thanks a lot. Questions, comments?
Stuart?
And the only other comment is, you sort of mentioned, but the context of the data, if you're collecting it from wearables or from patient interviews.
Oh, yeah.
The context of the data, depending on how you're collecting it, what happened to that person the day before? Are they now being influenced because they're wearing a wearable as opposed to before? Other issues like that. So the context of the data that's being collected is another critical factor in real world data.
Great, thanks. And any questions?
Peter, just to add something actually to that last comment. So I was at a different forum where a question arose, in the context of wearable information or even apps, where people can, have a Likert scale or something, where they're reporting something on a daily or regular basis. Is there, to Stuart's point, more potential or less potential for sort of this Hawthorne effect, right, where, just by the nature of the observation, you're changing the data that patients are reporting. And the response, which I thought was sort of interesting, was that people are more used to sharing information now through social media, that, it might not be subject to that sort of bias. But I'm sort of curious, if anybody else in this room sort of has a thought about that, because wearables, we put this into the context of, or in the category of real-world data. It's not part of a randomized clinical trial that's sort of being foisted upon the patient, but something that they can do as sort of a daily basis, recording their real-life experience. But I thought that was an interesting point that somebody, because I really didn't have an answer to that question of whether or not it's something that we can rely on those data or not.
And Sean?
So I would say, in the context of sleep, we have had issues, and we have to think very carefully about which data you show to the patient. So the wearing of the device is okay, but if you start to show the sleep measures, then some people do become obsessed about their sleep, and then it disrupts the sleep. So
it sort of becomes like a biofeedback.
And in a negative sense. So.
Other questions or comments?
I have one.
Lynn?
Oh, hey, Lynn.
Oops.
And I just wanted to share a little known case study, so to speak, on the first half of your talk, which is how do we get better quality real world data? And so one place to leverage are the societies and the organizations that clinicians participate in. So again, pulling from the spinal cord injury field, the International Spinal Cord Society actually developed data sets that they use in clinical care, and have worked very hard with groups to get those into the electronic health records, so that by building the community from the clinicians up, they know that in many hospitals that have Epic and other major servers for their clinical care, they can go down into that EHR and they can pull up these data sets and collect the same data that's being collected internationally. It's kind of an unusual circumstance, but it's a good model, and I think that they would be happy to share that with other communities. But that gets better quality real world data, I think.
If I can make one last comment, actually, on that same topic. So whether it's something that's through the course of a specific medical group that is trying to improve the data collection, the further back in time we go, the worse the data is, right? And a lot of it also in EMR has to do with meaningful use in terms of increasing requirements for data collection and documentation. So, data will certainly improve as we move forward. And going back further in time, the more that we leverage that sort of data, especially like in these large big data cloud environments, we have to be careful about how we use, how we use that data.
Great. Anything else? Let me ask if there are any general questions from anybody, for anybody on the panel that has just gone through from the breakout sessions? No? All right, then we're right on time.